Hello biology students, and welcome to the third video of the ecology unit. And in this video we're going to be focusing on our final topic for the unit, which is nutrient cycles. So one really cool thing to think about is that the atoms that make up you and make up all the things around you have been around for essentially since the creation of the universe. And that's because atoms are not, matter can't be created out of nothing, it can only be recycled into a different form. Which means that the carbon atoms are in all the other elements that make up you, or make up the bread you're eating for lunch, they could have been part of a dinosaur, or they could have been part of another person 400 years ago, or they could have been part of a rock 10 millions of years ago. And what we're going to be learning about in this video today are nutrient cycles, which are these processes that cycle these elements, and we're going to be focusing on a few elements like carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. They cycle through different living and non-living things. So the cycles that we're going to be focusing on today are the water cycle, the carbon cycle, which usually also cycles oxygen, and the nitrogen cycle. So let's start with the water cycle. So this is probably the one that you folks are most familiar with, because I know they cover it in most middle school science curriculums. And the water cycle, again, is just a cycle by which water cycles through different phases and different forms. So there are a couple different things I want you to notice here. So if we start with water in a body of water, like in an ocean or a lake, that water is in its liquid form. It can evaporate, which means turn into its gas form, and then condense into what's called a cloud. That water can then come back down to Earth via precipitation, which is like rain, snow, sleet. It can then run through different areas of the surface of the Earth, like it could sit in a lake, it could run off the surface of the Earth back into the ocean, it could run underground. If it runs underground, that water might be taken up by a plant root, and then the water can actually evaporate out of the leaves of the plant, so that's called transpiration. When water evaporates out of the leaves of the plant, it can form a cloud again via condensation, and it can repeat that whole process. So here's a summary of some of those keywords. So evaporation, we have water going from a liquid to a gas form. Transpiration was when water was evaporating from the leaves of plants. So, we already talked about a lot of these words, so you can pause the slide here and write down your definitions. So some new ones here is this one seepage. We didn't see that one on the picture. And seepage is when water moves from the surface of the soil down through the soil. So you can kind of think of it as water filtering through the soil itself. So again, these are all ways that water can move from one form or from one place to another. So now let's look at the carbon cycle. So the carbon cycle is a little bit more complicated. And the first thing I want you to take away is that carbon can exist in two main locations. Carbon can exist in the atmosphere, and in the atmosphere it's usually in the form of carbon dioxide. And it can also exist in what we call a carbon sink. Okay? And I want you to think of a carbon sink as like stored carbon. So that might be as part of a glucose molecule that makes up a plant. It could be part of a polysaccharide that makes up you, an animal. It might be as part of oil, as part of a fossil fuel. But carbon is always either in the atmosphere as CO2 or another gas, or it's in what's called a carbon sink. Also, carbon can be dissolved in the ocean. That's also a carbon sink as well. So if we look, there are a lot of ways that carbon can move from a carbon sink to the atmosphere. So for example, CO2 could undissolve from water and enter the air. CO2 that's stored deep in the earth as carbonate rocks. If a volcano erupts, that carbon could leave that carbon sink and go into the atmosphere. Also, every time humans burn fossil fuels, we're taking that stored carbon, the carbon in the carbon sink, and we're releasing it into CO2 into the atmosphere. Every time that a plant or a human does cellular respiration, we break down glucose into CO2 via cellular respiration. That's CO2 going from a carbon sink into the atmosphere. Okay. Now, let me erase some of these so it's a little bit cleaner. Okay, so those were some ways that carbon dioxide can go from a carbon sink into the atmosphere. However, CO2 can also go from the atmosphere into a carbon sink. However, there are fewer ways this can happen. There are two main ways. So one is that CO2 could be dissolved into water, and the other one's the big one. The other one is that CO2 can be taken in by plants and turned into glucose. And then because that glucose is now part of a plant or part of an animal that eats it, that carbon dioxide has gone from in the atmosphere to in a carbon sink, part of the animal or plant that it makes up. Those animals and plants could then die, and as they die, they might eventually, over the course of millions of years, turn into fossil fuels, because fossil fuels are just old ancient plants that have been put under a lot of pressure, high heat, to turn into oil. So these next couple of slides summarize exactly what I just said. So there are kind of four main places carbon can be stored. It can be stored in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, or it can be stored as what we're going to call a carbon sink. Okay, and carbon sinks come in many forms. Carbon sinks could be in an actual living organism as a polysaccharide or as a fat or as glucose. It can be stored in the earth as fossil fuels or underground in a volcano, or it can be dissolved in the ocean. Carbon can be released into the atmosphere, so it can leave a carbon sink by a byproduct of cellular respiration, when decomposers break down dead organic matter. A big one is when humans burn fossil fuels, right? We're taking that stored carbon and making it into CO2. When volcanoes erupt, and also when it gets very warm, CO2 tends to be released from the ocean back into the atmosphere. So kind of conversely, carbon can be removed from the atmosphere. The main way is by photosynthesis, because remember that plants, when they photosynthesize, they take CO2 out of the atmosphere and they make a carbon sink. They make a glucose molecule. That glucose can then be transferred through the food web. You know, if an animal eats a plant and then an animal eats another animal, it's just being transferred from one organism to the next. And eventually that carbon will be released back to the atmosphere, either through decomposition, when a decomposer breaks it down, or as waste from cellular respiration. And then finally, a more minor way that carbon can be removed from the atmosphere is if it dissolves into the ocean. However, it's important to note that carbon dioxide in any gas will dissolve in liquid more readily if it's at a cooler temperature. So actually, as the planet gets warmer from global warming, this one actually happens less often. Okay, so finally, the last thing I want to hit with the carbon cycle is the impact of humans, because humans have had a massive impact on the carbon cycle, and it's going to wreak havoc on our ecosystem, on our planet, if we don't do anything about it. And as you may know, the main way humans have been impacting the carbon cycle is the burning of fossil fuels. So remember that a lot of the carbon on our planet is stored in this carbon sink, in oil and gas and peat and coal, and these fossil fuels. It's stored carbon. However, we use these things to fuel our cars, to heat our homes, to power our electronics, to create electricity. And basically, we're taking all this stored carbon, and instead of having it be in a carbon sink, we're turning it into carbon dioxide and putting it in the atmosphere. In addition, humans are also destroying or taking away one of the only ways we have to get carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, by cutting down trees, to build new buildings or to create areas for animals to live, so that we can kill them for meat. So by destroying these plants, not only are we adding more CO2 to the atmosphere, but we're also getting rid of plants which photosynthesize, which is one of the only ways we have to get CO2 out of the atmosphere. So we're putting too much CO2 in, and we're not taking that much CO2 out. So you may be wondering, why is this a problem? And the main reason this is a problem is that carbon dioxide is really good at trapping heat. So if we have a lot of CO2 in the air, the atmosphere retains more heat. And if the atmosphere retains more heat, this means the average global temperature will increase, and even a tiny change in temperature can alter every ecosystem on the planet in a very dramatic way, which we're starting to see now. So kind of as a summary, human impact by decreasing the number of plants, increasing burning of fossil fuels, by doing these things, we're having a big impact on the ecosystem of our planet. Now, some of you may be wondering, well, why don't we just form more fossil fuels? You know, if we're burning them, why don't we store some of that CO2 as fossil fuels? And we can't do that because for the formation of fossil fuels takes millions of years. So it's really important that humans change their behavior quickly and soon if the planet as we know it is going to exist in a couple hundred years, or even sooner than that, really. Okay, so then finally the last cycle I want to discuss is the nitrogen cycle. And again, just like the carbon cycle, there's kind of two forms nitrogen can take. Nitrogen can be non-usable nitrogen in the atmosphere, so that's N2 gas. N2 gas actually makes up 79% of the gas in the atmosphere, so there's tons of nitrogen gas around us. But we're unable to use this. We can't take it in. Even though we need nitrogen for building proteins and building DNA, we cannot use it in the N2 form. So luckily, there are bacteria that can turn this unusable nitrogen into usable nitrogen. So if we look right here, we have bacterial nitrogen fixation. So these bacteria are nitrogen fixing bacteria. They can take this nitrogen out of the atmosphere and they can convert it into a form that plants and animals can use. So the usable form is called nitrates and nitrites. So then that nitrogen is now in the soil. It can be taken in by plants. When an animal eats a plant, the animal is getting that nitrogen. If the animal or plant dies, it's decomposed and goes back into the soil. So it's kind of cycled through the food web here. And then there are other bacteria that can take that usable nitrogen and they can turn it back into its non-usable nitrogen gas form again. So these bacteria over here, that turn the non-usable nitrogen into usable nitrogen, aren't the only bacteria in this system. There are also the denitrifying bacteria that can reverse the process. They take the usable nitrogen and make it non-usable. These bacteria over here that turn the non-usable nitrogen into usable nitrogen are also not the only way we can fix nitrogen, make it usable. Lightning strikes can also do that, but really these guys over here are the main way that we take N2 gas and make it usable for plants and animals. So to kind of summarize what I just said, so nitrogen in the atmosphere is not usable by most animals and plants. We inhale it and then we exhale it right back out again. So nitrogen gas, we can't use it. So it has to be fixed. It has to be made into a usable form. And this can be done by two processes, certain bacteria, which is the main one, and also lightning strikes. The process is called nitrogen fixation. Okay? So then plants can then use that fixed nitrogen that in its nitrate or nitrite form, and then they use it to make their own proteins. Then we eat plants and we get the nitrogen from them. Then eventually, we're breaking down and return to the soil. So then from there, a different type of bacteria take that usable nitrogen and make it non-usable again by a process called denitrification. And these are called denitrifying bacteria. Okay, folks, so that's it for the nutrient cycles, and I'll see you in the next unit.